For this activity, I'm going to look back at lesson planning, and the first thing I'm going to do is talk about a couple of the lessons that I've observed and what sort of effective strategies that I saw used by other teachers. The first teacher that I'm going to focus on is a gentleman named Sean McComb, and he teaches English language arts at a high school in Maryland. His lesson to me was extremely creative, extremely interesting, and very challenging for the students. What he did was give them the text of a speech that was a commencement speech by an author named David Foster Wallace, and it was a 9-page speech. What the assignment was to analyze the speech, and then the students were to create their own narrative using the same style that they identified in the speech in a strategy that Mr. McComb calls write like. Write like the other author wrote, with your own words and your own dialogue and narrative. And then they were to sort of act it out. They would each take turns reading their own narratives in front of the class. And I just thought that was extremely well-rounded and creative. You can see at the top here, it addresses 3 different standards, and I thought really well. It addresses 2 different reading standards. The one for what's the author's point of view, what is the style and basic content, and then the third one is a writing anchor standard that's about writing narratives.
Putting the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?"
So the first choice was to take a single 9-page speech and chunk it into 3 pieces. And then the scaffolding would come in where I would start with the first section and really lead them through that. So in that paragraph, I noted that he decided to open with a story, right? And that in that story, it uses dialogue. I just want us to be thinking about what is he doing? Not just what is he saying, but what is he doing throughout the speech? I think that no matter how much we want our students to collaborate, we need to make sure they have the tools to do that first. So my talking was trying to give them the tools to make sure they would be able to do it themselves. In your group.
Right. I really like that where he models what he wants them to do, because this is pretty sophisticated stuff. The speech is sophisticated and the analyzing it is as well. So I like that he does the modeling, and then next he breaks them into groups to do the next chunk. And so this is very much, the same as I do, you do, we do. And I think it's really effective. So here Mr. McCombs is checking in on some students, and this is an example of him using formative assessments.
What? All the grocery store stuff. That is a story, an example, right? He's using a concrete example here, and then over here he explains, gives a story, demonstrates. Perfect, right? Those are his moves. All right, so we need to pause here for today.
I just think that the video shows him being very engaged with the students. He's checking in with every group multiple times and making sure that they are feeling more comfortable with the analysis and helping draw out their thoughts that are not all the way formulated so that they can get something down on their notes. This lesson was a 2-day lesson, and I do believe that it was very well planned out. Mr. McCombs had it chunked into little digestible pieces all along the way. The second day, he broke the groups. Well, first of all, he modeled the write like with a completely different excerpt from a different piece of literature. And what he did is he took the piece of literature and he modeled the style, and then he put it more into, instead of like adult language, into teenage language. So that's what he's going to have them do in their own narratives since they're teenagers. Makes sense. And he breaks the class into 3 groups now, and they're each taking a section of the speech and drawing out what they think are the 2 main points in those sections of the speech. And they'll go from there. So I think the way he breaks it down, models exactly what he wants them to do, and I didn't show it, but he also had a chart where he had the sections of the speech, boxes, and had them write in each of those boxes what the key ideas were. So you can tell by looking around the room too, all eyes, when he's talking, all eyes are on him. The students seem very engaged, and he's got his with itness is definitely there. He's all around this room checking with individuals as well as groups. So I just think that he did a fantastic job on this lesson. I'm going to try this lesson, although it's hard, but I would like to try it myself. The second lesson I'm going to talk about is a science lesson that I observed. The teacher is Michelle Tang, and she's a science teacher at Broadway High School. The lesson was well planned out. She had the standards written on the board. She had the objective written on the board. And the thing that was really neat about it is it was completely student-centered. She gave them almost no direction in what they were to do, and it was definitely very creative, was to make a roller coaster out of ordinary household objects. She brought in a bunch of things like paper plates, straws, pipe cleaners, buttons, all kinds of things like that, and tons of supplies in the back of the room, but not standard. And they were to create a roller coaster, and then they had a rubric with certain criteria that had to be met. And one of the key things was it had to sustain a roller coaster for a ride, and it had to have a certain number of loops and things like that. And it was I want to say it was a 3-day project. It was either 2 or 3 days, and the students were broken into groups. They could choose their own groups, and it was 2 or more students, although there was one young lady who preferred to work alone. This activity, this lesson observation was done back in Module 4 when we talked about student movement, but I wanted to bring this up because it was very interesting how Ms. Tang controlled the class and assessed the students. So she spoke from up here, and the green is her movements, the red is the student movements, and the dots represent the groups of students. So what she would do is they didn't really have, she told them they could go one at a time back to the supplies, which were here, and then come back to their spots. So although the room was noisy, it was very well controlled, and I think it made the students more productive. So I thought that was a really good strategy. She was everywhere in this room. She was around doing assessments, formative, is that the word? Yes, formative assessments, the entire class. She was like a tornado. So that I thought was really effective. Couple students, would get frustrated, and she would just push them to think of other ways they could try it or other materials they could try. And it was very challenging, completely student focused. Like they had to, all she did was, that it was the classic, I'm the facilitator, you're the learner. And I thought that it was a really, really effective lesson. In the previous section of the video, I talked about some lessons that I observed that I thought were extremely effective. And I want to talk a little bit about another teacher that I observed where sometimes the lessons were effective, but a lot of the time I didn't think they were as effective as they could be. It was in literature class, English, and the teacher was we did a novel. And now I was a long-term substitute teacher at this school. I was the special ed teacher, so I did push-in. And so I actually observed his class for about 6 weeks. And we read 2 novels during that time. And the thing that he did really well is he did provide some different sorts of activities for the students to do. He broke up the activities a little bit. There was some variety there, but every day we did the same thing. We sat and read a portion of the book, and then they were to write a summary, and then he would give them different activities to do. And I don't necessarily think that is a bad plan, but the problem is these students were not, he either wasn't seeing where they were with formative assessments, or he just needed to keep going, and not that he didn't care, but he just kept going. So the novel was written at the time just post-slavery America, and so it was a little bit of older language and older style. And these students that were at the alternative high school that I taught at, and they're all pretty behind in reading and writing. And the thing that I noticed really early on is that they weren't really following what was going on in the book. And what the teacher would do is he would either have students read, take turns reading, or he would read. Now, when the students took turns reading, there were only a couple students who spoke loud enough and clearly enough that everybody else could hear them. And I kept trying to coach them to have their novel open and follow along, but they weren't real good at doing that. And then when he would read, his voice carried really well, and he used really good enunciation and would emphasize in the key parts, and he did a great job and people could follow along. But even I had a hard time following along when other students would read. Double-edged sword, because you want the students to read, but I think where I saw a place where he could improve would be to stop for understanding, and he never did that. So I would do that with my students, but we would have to wait till after the chapter was read. So that was one place where I felt like he was not really using formative assessments enough. And then he would help. Once he gave the assignment, he would go around and check in with students to see how they were doing. But for the most part, he would give, if it was a different assignment besides just a summary, I noticed he just kind of checked out, and he would go over and do his, like grading or doing the attendance, or there was also a score you had to put in daily for participation. And I know it's a lot to keep up with because I had my own classroom after this at that school, and I know it's a lot to keep up with, but I really felt like the students were not being served as well as they could be. Now that I've had the opportunity to plan some of my own lessons and even a unit, I will say that I have learned a tremendous amount. The biggest thing I've learned is how much work it is, but that's okay. I could see how it really pays off. The lesson plan I did, one of the lesson plans I did, the last one I did, I felt really proud of. I felt really good about it. It started off a lot shakier and got better as I went. And some of the things, I'm just looking at it here, some of the things I didn't really understand why I had to do some of the things on here, but I really tried to stick with it. And, things like looking at student diversity up front, like that would be such an easy thing to get caught up in the academics of what you're trying to get across that you would forget that. And I think it's really important to do that, to think about that in advance. The assessment piece is really valuable. I love the SMART objectives. That's awesome. I did observe another teacher at the same school I was just talking about, and she was so regimented about putting SMART objectives on the board every day. And she was another teacher I could have put in my observations. She taught math, and she had a routine, and it worked extremely well for those students. She would do objectives on the board. She would do a do now when the kids got in, and then she would do examples of things, and then she would turn them loose. And I thought her whole style worked really well. She's a new teacher, so she's schooled in more modern day techniques. The big ideas, never would have come up with that on my own, I don't think. I mean, I think it's one of the things you sort of know in the back of your mind, but you just document them, I think is wise. And then going through the strategies, the one thing I would add to the lesson plan template, and maybe it's just implied, but on the Teach Now one, doesn't really call out to like leave step-by-steps of exactly what you're going to do. And I think that that's important, because if you had to leave a lesson plan for a substitute, I think you would want that detail in there. Maybe it's not as necessary for a full-time regular teacher. The discussion topics, I kind of got a little bit frustrated with that part because I kind of didn't understand it, but as I moved through to my third lesson, it started to become a little bit more clear. And I like the materials and resources needed. Another thing that I might not really think about on my own, but I think it's really important to have that. And then the unit plan, I really enjoyed doing this unit plan. It pushed me, you know, I had my standard that I was working with, and I kept doing the activities around those. Really, it was just one standard. Sometimes I would weave in a second one, but then when it came to the unit, I felt like as much as that standard had, it was the standard about what the text says explicitly and what's inferred and how to cite your evidence. So it's a lot, and I could do at least a week on that, but I felt like it needed more when it came to the unit, so I ended up adding more to it, and I felt like it came out better. I thought it came out a lot better, and then I recognized the need to put in a few other standards from other areas. So this was a reading standard, but then I added in the writing standard as well, because taking the knowledge and then using it, and that gets you further up the Bloom scale as well. And you know, I ended up adding, I think I had really only I don't know how many lessons I had, but I ended up about doubling the amount of lessons. And by the end, I really feel good about the product that I produced here, this unit. And, you know, again, I got a little bit overwhelmed with thinking about, you got to do a lot of these to make a year. But I can totally see the value in it. And then with this unit that I planned, you know, year over year, I can just edit it. And it's just extremely, I mean, I think this is probably one of the most valuable things I've learned during this program is the lesson planning. And I thank you.